good morning or afternoon or evening or wherever this video finds you. My name is Michael Vincent. I'm a plant team member here at Magnified Church, and it's my joy this morning where I am right now to bring a short teaching from the Old Testament. I want to start with the same Old Testament framework that I use anytime I prepare to lead people through the Old Testament. There's three things we want to think about whenever we are handling Old Testament passages. The first question we ask is, what do we learn about God and about His nature from a passage? Many times the Old Testament teaches us who God is and how God is, and that can be very enlightening, especially as we carry it into today. The next thing we think about is, how is the stuff going on in this passage preparing the creation, making things ready for the incarnation of Christ. Christ is coming. The whole time the Old Testament points invariably to the coming of the Savior. And so how does this text help make the world ready for Christ's coming? And then the third thing that we should think about is, what does this passage tell us about how we should live now? This application question is maybe the most important one. What can we learn from the narratives and poetry of the Old Testament that inform us about how we should live going forward? So with that, let's dive into some text. I'm going to give you all a reprieve from reading because we're looking at several passages in the Old Testament that detail the extermination, large scale, of whole groups of people, men, women, children, old people, in most cases even the animals in these places are put to death. There's several places we could look at. Exodus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st Kings, all mention some form of this kind of activity. I'm going to focus today on sort of the Joshua 11 and 12, which is the summary of the three campaigns taking the Holy Land. Moses has a campaign against Edom and the kingdoms on the east side of the Jordan River, and then Joshua will have two campaigns, one in the south in Judah and another one north in Israel. By the time they're done, we know that there are 31 kingdoms. They list the names of 31 kings who were defeated in the course of these campaigns. 31 kings which each represent thousands, perhaps tens of thousands of people, totally and utterly destroyed. There are estimates that 60 to 80,000 people were killed in the course of this campaign, maybe tremendously more, and we have no idea how many animals were put to death in the course of this. We need to start by making a clear distinction between this and murder. This does not fall under the Exodus 20 prohibition of thou shalt not murder. Very distinctive, because this is a group of people in an organized fashion going forth to kill people they don't know, have never met. This is also not merely war. We would distinguish the combat of armies, of nations, justified or unjustified. That's not what's going on here either. This is the mass and wholesale slaughter. And so I think that the word that we would have to use, the thing that we would call this is genocide. Genocide is what this is. This is the killing of massive groups of people, particularly to include groups of unarmed or otherwise underdefended people. We would differentiate it from a hate crime in its scale. This is not just a few people killing a few other people. We would differentiate it from terrorism and its tactics and objectives. The goal of this is to sort of uninvent an entire group of people or entire communities of people. It's easily comparable to the Holocaust. It's comparable to the Rwandan genocide between the Hutsis and the Tutsis. It's comparable to the actions taken up on the Kurds in the 1970s. Comparable to the American expedition into the Native American lands in the late 1800s. As society, we would hold that Genocide is subjectively wrong. There's something very, very, very wrong with this sort of whole-scale slaughter of people with the named intent of removing them altogether from existence. Where do we ground that objective reality? Why do we base that on? I think that we would base it, from a biblical worldview, we take it all the way back to Genesis 4. We look at Cain and Abel, and God says, a man shall not kill another man. The blood of Abel cried out from the ground. In a secular perspective, we could talk about the importance of reciprocity, the advantages brought on by having societies that are stable, and we can be very sure no society can be stable where indiscriminate killing is allowed and takes place. Now, if we're going to be truly loving and lovingly truthful, we have got to be clear that these are acts of genocide. Calling it anything else is deceitful, perhaps first to ourselves if we believe that this is not genocide, and then to anyone else that we claim to that this is not acts of genocide. So the next thing we have to ask ourselves is, why? Why does this genocide take place? Why is this justified? If we look in Genesis 15, I'm going to start in verse 13. Then the Lord said to him, that is to Abraham, know for certain that for 400 years your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated there. But I will punish the nation that serves as slaves, and they will come out with great possession. You, however, will go to your ancestors in peace and be buried in a good old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure. So we see that there's a case here for divine retribution. The biblical authors didn't really have the language to fully enunciate how bad the people of Canaan were. We're not talking just human sacrifice. We're talking the active participation of the sacrifice of babies being burnt alive in altars designed specifically for that purpose. A common practice of this people was to slaughter a pregnant goat, cut its udders off full of milk, and then boil the unborn goats in their mother's milk udders, and many, many, many more activities and actions that are far too graphic for me to even begin to describe. I don't think that we have the language to understand the depravity of the Canaanites. So these were people who not just sinned, but sinned odiously and gratuitously for hundreds of years. God abided that for hundreds of years, knowing that even in Abraham's day, the people that Abraham lived around were in no way virtuous or righteous or good or deserving of anything but wrath for justice. But God abided that because he had a plan all along, and we see that plan come into fruition several hundred years later in the conquest of Joshua. We also see a different issue here, and that's the issue of abomination. Now, in our modern context, we don't think about abomination as being anything other than sort of bad. An abomination is an evil thing or a grotesque thing. But to the biblical authors, abomination meant something very specific. An abomination was an action or an activity or a condition that caused not only the perpetrator of an act to be maligned or worthy of judgment, it also brought judgment upon the very land itself, the community where that abomination took place also had to be cleansed and purified. So is this genocide in any way justifiable? We would say that certainly this is a unique case. We have to look first at not just the offense, but who the offense is against. The scripture makes it very clear that the offense of the Canaanites is not against Abraham, Isaac, Israel, or Joseph. It's against God. Just as there are varied consequences for the same acts carried out against different offended parties, whether it's you slap a teacher, that's one problem. You slap a police officer, another. You slap the president of the United States, a whole different set of consequences. Imagine the consequences of trying to reach out and slap God. That's part of what's going on here. There's also a sense in which we have to evaluate this. We have to evaluate the actions of the Canaanites on the terms that the Canaanites have set. We cannot merely evaluate this in a material sense of this just being transactional objectives between these biological primates. There's an immaterial idea behind what the Canaanites are doing. They are not merely burning their babies in furnaces as an extraction of devout belief. They are doing this with the stated objective of gaining evil supernatural powers, which they themselves recognize as wicked and cruel, so that they can use those wicked and cruel powers and visit them upon their own neighbors, carry out their own selfish objectives. So the Canaanites have, by the Canaanites' own standard, done something which is offensive to an immaterial way of relating between people. It is unexcusable. Some people may claim that it's unfair to sort of thrust a biblical worldview on a people who not only had no Bible, but also had no teaching or understanding of the God of the Hebrews anyhow. Abraham lived among them for more than enough time. Anyone who cared to know heard from Abraham that he followed God as he had come up from Ur. But there's more. In Romans, we see that a sort of a natural theology exists, that the manifestation of God is seen clearly throughout nature, so that people are without excuse. The Romans 1:18, it says, "The wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness. Since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, his eternal power, his divine nature, have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse." So the Canaanites are without excuse for their behavior. So this genocide happened, and it happened for a reason. Now some might ask, does this mean that genocide is justified in the Bible? And we have to be very clear in how we answer this, because in this case, in the case of the Old Testament, genocide is justified, and we're going to get into that now. But I want to make it clear that there's a difference in how this is treated in the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. We can see that very clearly in two stories. First, we look at the story of Achan from Joshua 7. Achan defied the orders of God and took for himself treasures, probably some silver statues from Jericho, and brought judgment upon the camp, upon the people of Israel. This was an abomination. It was abominable to do this. And so Joshua proclaimed that Achan's sins not only brought judgment upon him, but upon his whole house. And as a response, Achan is put to death in the valley of Achor, stoned. His belongings are heaped up with stone, and those stones are set on fire. Because we see that in the Old Covenant, abomination causes clean and sanctified things to become filthy. But then we go to Mark chapter 5, and we see a story of Jesus walking through a crowd. And a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. In the law of Moses, bleeding like that made one unclean. She would have been unable during that whole time to worship, to bring sacrifices to the temple, to touch any of her loved ones without making them similarly unclean. So this is a woman who's had a rough few years. She would have been completely cut off from her community and almost without hope, but she did have one hope. Verse 26, she had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and spent all that she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in a crowd and touched his cloak, because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. Immediately, her bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. And once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him, he turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" What we see is that in the new covenant, Christ makes the unclean things clean. We also see this when Jesus heals the leper in Matthew. I remember a joke several years back. Chuck Norris jokes were very popular when I was in high school. There was a joke about if Chuck Norris jumps in the water, he doesn't get wet, the water gets Chuck Norris. Now, as banal and juvenile as that sounds, it does a good job of demonstrating this point. In the Old Covenant, unclean things make the world around them unclean. But through Christ, Christians cleanse that which is unclean. The ministry of reconciliation through Christ means that when Christians encounter unclean things, abominable things, grotesque things, the presence of the Spirit of Christ cleanses them, restores them, and reconciles them. That is why there will never be a need for a genocidal cleansing through destruction, because we now have cleansing through reconciliation. So the question we're left with is, does this act degrade the moral authority of the Bible? Remember, we were searching for that standard earlier. What's the objective standard by which we determine that genocide is objectively wrong? We know this is not murder. We know this is not unjust. We know that this is not indiscriminate without a cause. If you'll look with me in Joshua 9, I won't read the whole text, but there's a narrative about one of the groups of Canaanites, the people of Gibeon. And the Gibeonites were allowed to live. They surrendered unconditionally to Joshua and the people of Israel, and they were not put to death. Now, they were put to hard labor, but that was because they deceived Joshua. They tried to pull a trick on Joshua, and as punishment, they were condemned to do hard labor for many generations. But conceivably, had the Jerichonites, had the Jebusites, had the Hittites similarly been happy to unconditionally surrender, to give up their old ways, to become cleansed, purified, circumcised, and to live at peace in, not with and alongside, but to be totally integrated into the people of God. Ostensibly, they'd have been allowed to. But that was not God's plan. God was demonstrating something. The actions here in the Old Testament demonstrate God's behavior and attitude towards sin. And before we close, we also want to be clear, this is not the same thing as war. There is moral grounds for a just war, for the defense of one's household and nation, for the defense of an otherwise underdefended or vulnerable people. The use of violence at any scale is justified, but genocide is not. And so any genocide is not permitted in war, and any acts of genocide in the course of war are necessarily sinful. And I want to be really clear about that no one who perpetrates genocide in the name of the waging of war is found guiltless. So what does this teach us? What do we walk away from? What are we left with? We're left with an incredibly clear picture. Where so often in the Old Testament, the narratives demonstrate with very concrete actions abstract ideas that we need to apply within our hearts. So what do we learn here is that the waging of total, absolute, and in some cases barbaric warfare against sin is not only justified, it's necessary. You cannot imagine the lengths that Christ would call you to make war against your own nature of sin. No means, method, or motivation is off the table for you to make war daily against your nature to succumb to temptation and sin. And if we learn anything from the story of Joshua, it's that you must make war on your sin in the same way the people of Israel make war on Canaan. I hope that this has been encouraging and challenging to all of you. I know that it has been a real journey for me to chew on these scriptures for some time. I am always happy to take time to talk to anyone who's interested. I look forward to seeing comments posted to this video, and feel free to reach out to me if you want to get a cup of coffee and have a more protracted dialogue about this. If you are interested in a community of faith that is unafraid to look very clearly and sober-mindedly at Scripture and all that it entails, I encourage you to join us at Magnify. We meet in the building of Redeemer Church on 4 o'clock on Sundays. Look forward to seeing you then. God bless.